Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me in the studio as ever we have Spike's Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line we have Spiked columnist Rakib Ehsan.
Hello.
Coming up on today's show, China's zero COVID protests, the UK census, the Buckingham Palace race row, and transgender Jesus. So China is experiencing a huge wave of protests, believed to be the biggest protest since Tiananmen Square in 1989. And it's all kicked off because of the zero COVID policy, almost 3 years of on-off lockdowns. Some of the most extreme restrictions in the world seem to have pushed people to breaking point. Tom, you've written about these protests this week. Do you want to say a bit about them? I mean, just first of all, it seems like the bravery of these protesters is extraordinary given the circumstances.
No, completely, especially because the pretty fearsome regime of state surveillance and censorship has, if anything, been bolstered over the period of the pandemic for obvious reasons. So the courage of these people to come out onto the streets and to, in many cases, not simply protesting against the lockdown restrictions, so that's certainly a core part of it and the trigger for a lot of what we're seeing now, but actually, you know, saying the unthinkable and that it's time for Xi Jinping or for the CCP to step down. Direct protests against, I say direct, but kind of the white paper, blank sheet of paper protests against state censorship. So what you're really seeing is this morphing into a pretty significant challenge and affront to the ruling regime. It's been building up for a good few weeks now. I don't know if people remember during the Chinese Communist Party's Congress, there was the bridge man who unveiled these banners over a bridge in Beijing, not only rehearsing slogans around COVID, saying we want food, we don't want PCR tests, but also saying we want to be citizens, not slaves, and calling for Xi Jinping to step down and so on. And since then, we've just sort of continued to see kind of unrest pop up here or there, often focusing around the COVID rules. There were this remarkable scenes at the Foxconn kind of iPhone plant, which is this huge facility in central China where about half of the world's iPhones are made, where you had loads of workers, sort of internal migrant workers, just completely disappear one day. A few hundred of them left to try and avoid the quarantine rules, which have become incredibly punishing. We've seen other scenes there, obviously in Xinjiang, which has been in lockdown for like 3 months now, and under, it seems like, more punishing restrictions in other areas. We've seen protests there. We've also seen protests in the south, people breaking through the kind of COVID barriers and physically clashing with the kind of hazmat-suited officials there. And then also this spreading to the cities and to students as well, who are more explicitly kind of, in many cases, chanting kind of anti-regime slogans. So it's really significant. Of course, everyone reaches for the Tiananmen example. Often it's not necessarily that useful, but whilst you could say this is naturally very different to 1989, it is still the most significant kind of movement we've seen since then. And regardless of what happened next, this is a serious challenge, not just to the zero COVID policy, but also to the regime itself. And as you say, you're just left with the remarkable bravery of it, regardless of what happens next.
Sticking to the zero COVID policy for now, I mean, it is extraordinary to see, in the name of safetyism, this allegation that in Xinjiang, people were essentially left to burn to death, caught up in a fire. Lockdown rules supposed to save people's lives, but actually hindering people's ability to escape. Rakib, what have you made of that kind of extremism, I guess?
Oh, I think that's the correct term to use. It is extremist policy. A lot of the COVID, zero COVID policies that we've seen implemented by the Chinese Communist Party, utterly dehumanizing, if truth be told. And it's actually no surprise to me that even though such an authoritarian regime is in place, you can see the level of public dissent against those policies. And I think more widely, we've seen this week that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, saying that the golden era of UK-China relations is over. And I think further down the line, when it comes to foreign policy, I'd like to see the UK continue to criticise the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And also, I think that we need to invest more in alliances such as the D10, which is essentially a club of democracies, which incorporates the Group of Seven, but also Australia, South Korea, and India, which essentially looks to reduce those democracies' collective economic dependence on China.
And in terms of the sort of foreign aspect, Tom, I mean, there has been, obviously the criticism of the Chinese regime is warranted, but there is an element of brass neck with some people coming out supporting the protest, particularly Justin Trudeau. Of course, he's nothing like the CCP, but he's certainly on the authoritarian end of the Western liberal kind of
I think
lockdowners.
Yes, exactly. I think his exact words were that the lockdown protesters should be free to express themselves, which will obviously stick in the core of anyone who watched with horror, as Canada at one point was certainly leading the world or leading the Western world, we should say, the supposedly free West, in terms of cracking down on dissent around COVID, vaccine mandates, the treatment of the truckers' protests there, not just the demonisation of them, but the treating them effectively as a terrorist threat. And again, clamping down on them, passing pieces of emergency legislation, essentially, and emergency powers, essentially allowing them to starve them of funds and so on and so forth. So to see these people turn around now and pose as sort of warriors for liberalism is more than a bit rich. In a sense, obviously, what we've seen in China has been horrendous, and it's also given the lie to the sort of propaganda of the CCP, which was to say that COVID and the pandemic would almost vindicate their model, if you like, that this is if anything, the world will see the wisdom of this supposedly incredibly efficient, authoritarian, personalist regime. And
collective and socialist and, good for the benefit of all.
All of that is now completely fraying, obviously, because of how things are playing out. Also, incidentally, some of the ridiculous decisions they've made, they haven't actually, their own kind of domestic vaccines are really not up to snuff. They're refusing to actually import any of the kind of Western-made mRNA vaccines for reasons of propaganda and shamefacedness, it seems like, more than anything else. And also, just despite the fact that they're maintaining this incredibly tyrannical lockdown regime, failing to get particularly the most vulnerable and the elderly actually vaccinated. So they kind of find themselves in this tremendous bind. And all of that is now starting to fray. People are watching, heavily censored, but nevertheless still watching kind of images from the World Cup and seeing people, cheek by jowl enjoying themselves and wondering what the hell is going on. But in a sense, we might have expected CCP-led China to take an incredibly authoritarian response to the pandemic. What was always striking about it was that supposedly free West so readily pursued that particular path to suggest that, of course, something has to be done, but we're not going to throw out our whole alleged way of doing things here in relation to freedom and the rule of law and so on. But, in the words of Neil Ferguson, they never thought they would get away with it here, but they did end up getting away with it here. And that's one of the things that is worth reflecting on. So at the moment, we've got the people in China having a reckoning with their own rulers, but we definitely need a reckoning with ours over our own excesses, whilst they might, when you look at what's going on in various parts of China at the moment, pale in comparison, certainly. It's something that warrants thinking about deeply as to why we ended up kind of following that particular path, even in a kind of reduced aspect, if you like.
Yeah, and Rakib, what do you make of the fact that, we obviously didn't go as far as China, but there are some people who, let's say, kind of admired the Chinese approach. And obviously, they are not as authoritarian as the CCP, but people like Jeremy Hunt come to mind, who in 2020 was talking about zero infection, which sounds a bit like zero COVID. Various people on SAGE and that independent SAGE group talking about the Chinese model being preferable or zero COVID being preferable. I mean, how should we reckon with that? It's quite alarming, really.
It is, Fraser. And I think if I remember correctly, that there was an individual involved in the independent SAGE group who was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain.
Susan Mickey, she was part of SAGE.
She was part of SAGE and Independent SAGE, opposing herself.
So, no, I agree. I think that we did have certain politicians who were promoting I wouldn't say a strict approach. It was dangerously close to some of the zero COVID policies that we saw being implemented in China, and I think, to be honest, there wasn't much intellectual depth in terms of really examining what could be the negative side effects of those policies. That's what I felt at the time. We see now, for example, a record number of children being admitted to language therapy because there's such a lack of social interaction under lockdown. Their linguistic development has really suffered as a result of that. There's that phenomenon of absent children, children just not returning to school, exceptionally high rates of absences. So I think that those kind of possible outcomes, which have now materialized, I don't think they were even being talked about very much at all. And of course, there were groups which were vulnerable, more vulnerable than other groups to COVID, but there wasn't much discussion about mental well-being. People, for example, who are living on their own in fairly tiny flats. What kind of impact would those lockdown restrictions have on their mental health? I just felt that many of those conversations were needed, but they weren't really had.
And you are just reminded like how much us as human beings the world over, you just need freedom and you need one another. And as soon as those things are choked off, even in the relatively limited sense as it was over here, or the incredibly extreme means in which that has taken place in China, even just your ability to go about your daily business just completely taken away from you. What a profound and corrosive impact that has, the human toll of all of that, all of the horror stories from China that you've seen of suicides through to people not being able to get treatment for their ill children in time and so on and so forth. You're seeing that even in places like China, which often there is this kind of caricature of they're just very compliant, aren't they? They prioritize stability and in the case of the kind of upper middle class, some kind of economic advancement over these broader appeals. You are just seeing that kind of yearning for a properly kind of free, and in many cases the more radical extent of these protests, actually democratic kind of life is still kind of not been extinguished. And that's incredibly inspiring, even if it took a lot of horrendous things to get us to this particular point with these protests.
I love Christmas. Carol services, the panto, mulled wine and mince pies, office parties, and this year the football too. And with all that Christmas socialising, it's important for me to look my best. Luckily, thanks to Harry's, shaving has never been easier. With the weighted handle of Harry's razor, I always feel in control, even when getting to those hard-to-reach spots. The Harry's shave gel protects my skin and gives me a smooth finish every time. In these cold winter days, I've also been using the Harry's Hydrating Night Lotion to keep my skin feeling fresh. Basically, Harry's just makes shaving effortless. Because I have a subscription, I never even have to worry about forgetting to buy my shaving gear. And if I want to adjust or switch up any of the products I get, I can always make any changes directly from my account page. Once you start shaving with Harry's, you'll never look back. The best way to start is with a Harry's trial set, which includes the night lotion. Spiked podcast listeners can now get one for free. So, make sure to support our podcast and start your own skincare journey by redeeming a free Harry's trial set. All you need to cover is the £3.95 for delivery. Just head to harrys.com/spiked and have your trial set and night lotion delivered to your door. That's harrys.com/spiked. So in the past week or so, we've had two big kind of data releases, I think it's fair to describe them as. We had the immigration figures last week suggesting net migration at almost record highs. And this week we had the UK census, which has essentially shown much larger proportion of ethnic minority Britons. Decline in Christianity is another one of the sort of headline figures. Tom, I think it's fair to say a lot of the discussion around this has been unedifying, to say the least, from left and right. I mean, what have you made of that?
No, I think unedifying is definitely the word. It's probably a tamer word at the end of the spectrum in terms of what's taking place, because you have seen in relation to these two pieces of data, essentially you have the kind of liberal left, the sort of Remainer set, who are basically celebrating this bit with a hint of sort of menace. It's like, ha, 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 you idiot racist Brexiteers voted to pull up the drawbridge, but actually there's more of them here than ever. Don't you feel stupid? Which again is like weaponized. Like these, if anything proves that these people don't actually care about migrants and migration, they just hate the people who are already here. I think that's a perfect example of it. And then you do have on the kind of anti-immigration right, a sort of very unedifying kind of, you got the liberal left virtue signalling, you got the sort of anti-immigration right kind of vice signalling, kind of like dipping the toe in a bit of white identity politics, bemoaning the sense that white people are in decline. I think the census data suggests a 4 percentage point decrease over the course of 10 years in the people who identify as white British, as well as the, Christianity dipping below 50%, as we've been talking about. And there's been a bit of nods and winks, I think, in some of those statements that people have come out, to be perfectly frank. What I think is interesting is that you see, first of all, there is a bit of a misrepresentation of what's going on here. I mean, insofar as last year was a pretty unique year. You obviously were opening up after the pandemic, but also we had obviously a lot of inflows from asylum routes and actually specific bespoke asylum routes, whether it's Hong Kong, Ukraine, of course, as well as Afghanistan, which do have a measure of popular support. And also the fact that, unlike, as David Goodhart pointed this out on Unheard, unlike kind of previous eras of free movement, these people are here either as students or on work visas. This is a different kind of kettle of fish. And also that in terms of the public mood, people are, broadly speaking, if you take the public as a whole, attitudes to immigration have, if anything, been softening in recent years, becoming more pro-immigration in general. And also any of this kind of alleged racism, fear of replacement or so on and so forth that both sides are kind of talking up is not really there either. It's a very tiny minority who think that to be English or British is a white thing at this point. So, kind of on the particulars, there's a bit of bad faith. But also I think what you see is that both extremes, if you like, buy the same bullshit, which is that British people on the whole are a bit wary, a bit scared of outsiders. Yes, that this isn't just about concern about uncontrolled immigration, that they're actually effectively kind of xenophobic. One side sees that more approvingly than the other. Yeah. But I think both sides have revealed that they actually share some prejudice as much as they also hate one another quite bitterly, obviously.
Yeah, because Rakib, ultimately, this kind of demographic sort of shift is separate from the small boats issue that people might have concerns about. I mean, really, it's nothing to fear, right? This is just a quite normal change.
Well, I think that, as you clearly mentioned, there has been a significant decline of Christianity in the last 2 decades. I think in the 2001 census, over 7 in 10 people in England and Wales identified as Christian. That dropped to 59.3% in 2011, and now it's, for the first time, it's dropped below half, 46.2%. I found some of the reactions to the new census data bizarre. If truth be told, there's some people blaming high levels of immigration on the decline of Christianity, when I'd argue immigration is the main reason why Christianity is being kept alive in certain parts of the country, especially when you're thinking about Black African migrants in Southeast London, and also you have we've experienced a great deal of Eastern European migration in recent times, especially from EU member states such as Poland and Romania. The Polish communities have definitely injected considerable energy in Roman Catholicism in Britain, especially in West London, places such as Ealing. And you do have Romanian Orthodox churches dotted all around London now, places like Holborn, East Ham, East Finchley. So there's been some very questionable takes, if truth be told, when it comes to the census data. I think that you have what I consider to be the demography anxious right, who do entertain those white replacement theories. I think a really important point to be made is that if certain ethnic and religious groups prioritize, for example, the institution of marriage, they see having children as an essential part of adult life. If certain groups prioritize that more than others, that's going to be reflected in population change. So I think a lot of the debate is not so much on immigration, but it's rather, if we're looking at the white British mainstream, there's been a rapid secularization, and I think that has fed into some of the demographic shifts that we've seen, especially over the last 2 decades.
Tom, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, one thing I think this would be useful going forward is just to kind of clear a lot of the bad faith out of this particular discussion. Yeah. To clear away a lot of these stereotypes and to actually kind of have a fundamental discussion about what the public's concerns are about immigration and how we might have a much more sensible debate going forward, because of the fact that there's just so much nonsense flying around, and also there's so much misunderstanding about what people are fundamentally concerned about. Really, things like the small boats crisis creates a sense of just chaos and a lack of control, a lax approach to security, even a sense of who is actually in the country and for what reasons and so on. I think people are fundamentally concerned about integration as well, which is to me, as someone who's very pro-migration, despite it, of course, is not only kind of entirely reconciled to kind of pro-migration approach, but I think particularly in the current context, it depends on it. The fact that we're saying that this isn't about just inviting people to come into the country so they can be all of these kind of different communities, which to the extent they have much to do with each other, it's not that much. But actually suggesting it's about finding what everyone has in common, having a discussion around those kinds of particular issues, taking the public seriously as well, not just kind of if you're a Tory party saying you'll do one thing and then not doing the other, or just proving yourself woefully incompetent at dealing with issues on the border and so on. I think we just need to take the public a lot more seriously. We take concerns more seriously, and also push aside anyone who just wants to, for differing reasons, kind of weaponize this issue, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because with the people caught in the middle of that, and not only the people coming to this country to start another life, but also the British public, who it seems to me on both sides of this debate held in pretty low esteem in many respects.
Have you signed up to become a Spiked supporter yet? Spiked Supporters is our thriving donor community. And if you're a Spiked supporter, you can get access to a whole range of extra perks. And I've got an incredibly special one I want to tell you about. On Monday, the 19th of December at 7 p.m. London time, we have the brilliant Toby Young joining Brendan O'Neill for a special live recording of The Brendan O'Neill Show. And it's exclusive to Spiked supporters. You'll be able to watch the recording online, plus we'll also be taking audience questions. So if you're already a Spiked supporter, why not claim your free ticket now via the Spiked Supporters Hub? If you're not a Spiked supporter yet, then now is the time to sign up. For as little as £5 or more per month, you can become a Spiked supporter, then you can sign up to this free event. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up now. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. See you there. So let's move on to talk about what has perversely become, certainly today at least, the biggest story of the hour. Turn on the BBC and you can't miss it. It's the Buckingham Palace race trial. So Lady Susan Hussey, who is Prince William's godmother, has resigned from her position as a royal aide, having committed what I think you could describe as a microaggression to use today's lingo, because she repeatedly asked a charity boss, "Where are you really from?" trying to get to the bottom of her kind of ethnic background. Rakib, what have you made of this incident?
Oh, well, I've been asked on plenty of occasions where I'm from by white British people. And if truth be told, I've never taken it as a form of racially motivated maliciousness. I more than anything, I've treated it as a much appreciated form of friendliness, curiosity, and interest. When I'm asked that question, being quite the conversationalist, I like to provide a comprehensive answer. I say that I was born in Hammersmith in West London. My family home is in Luton, and I'm predominantly of Bangladeshi origin. It covers all the multiple layers of my identity, which I'm quite proud of. I think that we have a current cultural environment which is quite unforgiving, if not quite hostile towards the older generations. Yeah. You can't really keep up with, how do you say, these politically correct advances, or you could call them cultural codes, if you like, surrounding race. I just felt with that particular interaction, there was an opportunity there for Ngozi Fulani to open up and talk about the richness of her ethnic identity, her cultural heritage. She was talking up her African heritage a great deal this morning in the media. So I'm not really sure why she had such a problem with doing that when it came to that conversation with Lady Susan Hussey. Now, of course, when you ask people questions about their identity, their ancestry and heritage, a certain degree of tact and sensitivity would be welcome. But I really want to make this point that the question, "Where are you from?" has probably formed the basis of some of the most interesting, fascinating and educational conversations I've had in my hometown of Luton. In fact, it's almost a source of social bonding in a way, learning about other people's migratory family history, their cultural background, and their ethnic identity. I think those conversations, of course, I think in a diverse society such as ours, when you have those forms of intergroup contact, there's going to be misunderstandings along the way. And at times people may well feel disrespected. But I think in the long run, if you manage those conversations well, in good spirit, that actually helps to cultivate social solidarity in a society as diverse as ours.
I think you've alluded to something quite important, which is the kind of, it is interesting to learn about people's migratory backgrounds and family backgrounds, and it's also something that is kind of expected of us now in the current climate. And talked about Ngozi, who says she was proud of her African heritage. Simultaneously, we're supposed to be interested in people's backgrounds, but apparently we're not allowed to ask for it, or at least we're not allowed to ask for it in the way that Lady Hussey asked for about it.
I mean, that it's one of those. Rakib made the point very well in his piece for Spike this week, but how there's this sense that you can't win with racial identity politics at the moment. So we talk constantly about how there's all these codes for how you're supposed to act and how you're supposed to deal with this particular issue, but the codes are constantly contradictory.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, as you say, people should take interest in one another's cultures, backgrounds, heritage, whatever. But at the same time, trying to actually express that curiosity could get you in a hell of a lot of trouble. Yeah. Remember in John McWhorter's book about woke racism, he's got this whole kind of contradictory catechism of you should show interest in other people's cultures, but don't culturally appropriate. You know, you should date people from other ethnicities, but don't exoticize them. There is this kind of sense of whatever the opportunity is to essentially just indicate that you believe racism exists and that it's a big problem. You take that, regardless of what the kind of facts on the grounds are, the nature of the actual conversation. And the thing about microaggressions as well is the sort of thing now, first of all, if someone wanted to express their racism, it's an incredibly passive-aggressive way of doing it. I mean, are we genuinely suggesting that the point that this 83-year-old woman was trying to make was you don't belong here in the course of this particular line of questioning? I'm not. That seems to me a pretty unsympathetic way of reading the particular situation. Yes, people can be clumsy. Yes, people can cause offence. That's the nature of living in a diverse society. Sometimes you don't understand, that you might be hurting someone's feelings in some way, shape or form. But surely the response to that is to be a bit more generous, is not to have those kinds of heightened sensibilities, not to have a kind of performative sense of victimhood. And also, ultimately, you do just worry that in general, we could talk about little unique cases here or there and what happened and who said what and what their side of the story is. But encouraging a kind of prickliness, encouraging an oversensitivity, encouraging a fear of saying the wrong thing to the point where that paralyzes you is surely the worst possible outcome if you are genuinely interested in having a kind of diverse but also integrated society. But that seems to be the logical product of all of this sort of chatter. There's no other consequence of it, surely.
Right, so let's move on to transgender Jesus. This is a very curious story. Basically, at the weekend, a junior research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, delivered this sermon where he essentially speculated that Jesus could be called trans. That sounds a bit strange. His rationale for this, and this gets even weirder, is that the wound of Christ when he was on the cross, one of the sort of flesh wounds that he sustained, is often depicted in kind of medieval art as looking akin to a vagina. And so this flesh wound perhaps suggests that Jesus could be genderless, could be beyond biological sex. I mean, he is presumably, being God himself as well, doesn't have a biological sex. But,
I'm just enjoying watching you try to articulate this.
It's so mad that I'm struggling to explain it. But really, then the idea, then this researcher said that this means that Jesus was transgender.
Or that Christ's body is the Christ's
body is the trans body.
There's often these layer of meanings that I don't necessarily 100% get, because it's kind of, you're just talking in a kind of artistic sense, a spiritual sense. Do you mean that he was literally transgender as you would understand it? I mean, but also because of the fact that his reasoning for this seems to go back to a pretty unpleasant sort of reduction to womanhood, to a bleeding wound, effectively, which seems, to put it kindly, odd, and to put it less kindly, quite sexist. I don't know how he necessarily squares.
I mean, there are some synonyms for the ladies' parts that have that connotation, which we would not say out loud because it's outrageous. Rakib, what have you made of this?
Oh, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, being a Muslim social conservative, that the idea that people are now trying to transgender Jesus is just. It's just absolutely. It just shows how radical transgenderism will try and worm its way. It's one of the crudest forms of historical revisionism I've come across for some time, if truth be told. All I can say is it's a good thing that Christians on the whole are quite tolerant, because if this was tried with other prophets, I think the reaction would be far more severe.
Someone did scream out heresy during the reading. But you're right, that's probably quite a mild response.
There's a line that even the Anglicans won't allow to be.
But they're talking about the historical revisionism. I mean, this is sadly, this is not a lone example. You know, we've had people try to claim that some of the female queens of Egypt were transgender because they're depicted in statues with the long beard. People have tried to claim that
Joan of Arc's non-binary.
Joan of Arc is non-binary. You can go and see that at the Globe now.
I think people have tried to say that about Elizabeth the First as well.
Yes,
which is also an interesting sort of sense that if you have a figure who is seen to have been pushing up against the kind of expectations of womanhood in a particular period by being a leader or by being a warrior or whatever, that by dint makes them more likely to be it's a very odd...
they're basically a man, aren't they? Pushing towards being a man. My other favourite story is about non-binary skeletons. We had a great piece in Spiked on that a couple of months ago, but basically, radical transgender activists in the kind of archaeology community or the anthropology community trying to say that because we don't know what gender people identified as, we should not classify bones as having a certain biological sex.
It's outrageous, even though I'm sure you could tell via very rudimentary
You really
tests.
can tell, yes.
But just to plug another Spike piece, Gareth Roberts' piece on Spike this week about trans Jesus was brilliant. And also because he made this speculative, but I think quite powerful point about how when you're talking about Oxbridge and Cambridge and all these seats of higher learning, all these kind of elite institutions, and the way in which they are essentially making the most astonishing statements imaginable. And he kind of makes the point that this is almost like a kind of power move.
Yeah.
We're in a kind of culture at the moment in which even saying observably true things can mark you out as a heretic, as a wrong, and as someone who should be cancelled if you believe in biological sex and so on and so forth. And yet they can say the most outrageous things.
Yeah.
And sort of get away with it. And he likens it to the Bullingdon Club. It's like a new Bullingdon Club.
Yeah.
We can come in, we can smash things up, and you can't. We can get away with it, and you can't. And I thought that was a very funny, but also quite a striking way to think about this whole culture war that we find ourselves in, which, as we all know, often sort of takes on a kind of class war form to it in many cases.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.